All right, today we're diving into a fascinating theory. It's an idea that claims there's a predictable pattern, a seven-stage cycle to be exact, that has supposedly dictated the rise and fall of every single major empire over the last 2,000 years. So the source we're looking at kicks things off with a real bang, a dramatic hypothetical scenario. Imagine it. It's 2:01 a.m. U.S. helicopters descend on Venezuela, the president is taken, and just like that, control over the largest oil reserves on Earth changes hands. I mean, the stakes are set incredibly high from the very first sentence. But here's the question the theory wants us to ask. Is something like that just a random act of foreign policy? Or could it be something else entirely? Could it actually be a predictable symptom of a much, much larger cycle that's been repeating for centuries? And that brings us to the core thesis. The argument is that there's this inevitable pattern at play, one that doesn't care about our modern technology, about geography, or about politics. From the sandals of ancient Rome to the stealth helicopters of today, the fundamental script, it argues, is always the same. So here's the claim in a nutshell. Every single major empire moves through the exact same 7 stages, from its glorious rise all the way to its inevitable collapse. Now, that is a massive claim, so let's break down exactly what these 7 stages are supposed to be. So, what is this master blueprint for an empire's life cycle? It's all broken down into 7 very distinct stages. Understanding this sequence is really the key to the entire theory. Okay, so it all starts with what's called sound money. This fuels a period of expansion and new social programs, but that growth often leads to military overextension and something called debasement. This then pushes the empire into a phase of desperate resource acquisition, which, as you can imagine, causes a loss of confidence. And from there, it's a downward spiral into fiscal dominance and finally, collapse and reset. And this is where it gets really interesting, especially when you compare stage 1 to stage 3. In stage 1, you have sound money, currency that's backed by something real, like gold. Wealth is built on actual productivity. But by stage 3, that's all out the window. The currency's basically printed out of thin air, and the government starts paying its bills with inflation, which silently eats away at everyone's savings. Now, a theory is just an idea, right? Well, this framework argues it's not just an idea. It's written all over the pages of history. So let's take a look at the evidence that's presented to back this cycle up. Just take a look at the Roman denarius. It was the dollar of its day. Back in 64 AD, it was almost pure silver, 94%. But as the empire's bills got bigger and bigger, they just kept reducing the silver content. Fast forward to 265 AD, and it was only 0.5% silver. I mean, the coin looked pretty much the same, but its actual value was almost completely gone. And the result? An absolute catastrophe. This debasement is said to have triggered hyperinflation of over 1,000%. The entire economy just seized up. People stopped trading. Anyone who had saved their wealth in those coins, they were completely wiped out. It wasn't just a bad recession, it was the beginning of the end for the empire. And the thing is, Rome wasn't some isolated case, not according to this theory anyway. Look at the Dutch in the 1700s. Their currency, the guilder, collapsed after a costly war pushed the nation into bankruptcy. Then you have the British Empire. After 2 devastating world wars, huge debts forced them off the gold standard, and the pound sterling just lost its grip on the world. It's the same story, just with different characters. So you can probably guess where this is all going next, right? This historical lens is now being applied directly to the United States, with the argument being that America is not and cannot be immune to this 2,000-year-old pattern. According to this framework, the U.S. kicked off its cycle in stage 1 back in 1944 when the dollar was backed by gold. But then comes the big pivot point, 1971. That's when the U.S. officially cut the dollar's tie to gold, essentially opening the door to stage 3 and allowing new money to be created without any tangible backing. And this is where it all connects back to the very beginning. The theory claims the U.S. is now deep into stage 4. And that shocking, hypothetical raid on Venezuela? Well, it's presented as a textbook example of desperate resource acquisition, an empire trying to grab hard assets to prop up a shaky financial system. To back this up, the analysis starts throwing out some truly mind-boggling numbers. First up, the national debt, $38.5 trillion. It's a number so huge it's hard to even wrap your head around it. But it's not just the total amount, it's the speed. The data in this analysis shows the debt growing by more than $70,000, not per day, not per minute, every single second.
Now, this is presented as a huge red flag, a sign that stage 5, the loss of confidence, is already kicking in. The analysis points out that a record 142,000 millionaires supposedly moved out of their home countries in 2025. The argument is that this is the biggest voluntary wealth migration in history, as capital quietly searches for safer havens.
So all of this, the debt, the spending, the loss of confidence, it's all building towards what the theory calls the end game. It's not just another economic downturn. It's a fundamental rewiring of wealth, something it calls the Great Wealth Transfer. The fancy term for this point of no return is fiscal dominance. This is stage 6. So what does that actually mean? Well, it's basically a trap. It's the moment a country's debt is so huge that the central bank is forced to print money just to make the interest payments, leaving it with two terrible choices: either default on its debt or ignite hyperinflation. And to really hammer this point home, the theory uses a hypothetical quote for the near future, attributing it to former Fed Chair Janet Yellen. The message is clear. The conditions for walking into this financial trap aren't just some abstract possibility. They're actively getting stronger. So what happens when that trap finally springs? You get a great wealth transfer. See, wealth doesn't just vanish into thin air, it moves. The argument is that it flows away from people holding the currency, in cash or bonds or savings, and it flows directly to people holding hard, tangible assets, things you can't just print more of. Okay, so after painting this pretty grim picture, the theory doesn't just leave you hanging. It also talks about how people might try to navigate this whole thing, based on what has happened in every other empire collapse throughout history. So what are these supposed survival strategies? Well, they boil down to a few key ideas. First, own tangible assets that hold their value. Second, develop skills that are always essential no matter what the economy is doing. Third, create what it calls optionality. Basically, don't be tied to a single country or system. And finally, diversify your wealth across multiple currencies. And that's where this whole analysis leaves us, with a question aimed squarely at you. It argues this pattern is a constant of history, that the transfer is coming one way or another. And it leaves you with one final, pretty provocative thought. If this cycle really does play out again, which side of that great wealth transfer are you going to be on?